Let's look now at the impact rents have on the economy, on the institutional setup, on the social arrangements, but also on the psyche of people. But before we come to this, let's try to remember one of the things we mentioned in the very first week of this course. You know that I mentioned the problem of essentialism. And if you remember, essentialism is the view that for any specific entity, such as whether it's an animal, a human being, a group, a concept, that there's a set of attributes which are necessary to its identity and function. And that these essential qualities of the object are those properties that make the object what it is. And without these attributes, it wouldn't be what it is. And it is now often claimed, both by people within the community and from people from outside looking at the community, that if you want to understand a Muslim, you have to look at Islam, that Islam is that essential quality that determines the identity and function of any Muslim human being. And that without Islam, you cannot understand what he or she is, and that without, therefore, understanding Islam, you don't get what sort of drives these people. And contrast this claim that Muslims are determined in everything they do and think by their religion. Contrast this claim with arguably the most important single factor that determines living conditions and state arrangements in the region, namely what we just discussed in the last video, the rentier nature of their economies. It's something that a great deal of social scientists have analyzed, and I invite you, when we talk next week about Iran, for example, Homar Khatouzian's book on the political economy of Iran takes the rental nature as its point of departure and explains a lot of the dysfunctionalities and peculiarities of, in this case, Iran. And he does not have to have recourse at all to religion. Although we all know, and we will learn, that religion then plays an important role in the political development of the country. But what drives the factors are economic relations or political relations. And that I'd like you to keep in mind the danger of essentialism, of attributing and simplifying complex human beings and complex societies to one single factor and over-determining outcomes through this one factor. Just try to keep it in mind. Now, let's look at the impact rent and rental income has on societies. Let's start with the economic impact it has. And there is another technical term that's it's often used. It's called the Dutch disease. It's a term that the Economist newspaper coined in the 1970s, when Holland, that had just discovered a major gas field and therefore was benefiting from large foreign resource inflows into its economy, it then experienced the paradoxical effect that its domestic industry began to shrink. And the explanation that was found is that with the inflow of foreign currency to pay for the gas in this case, the local currency appreciates, and that makes the local industry and its products less competitive on an external market. And it also leads to inflation in the domestic economy, both of which then leads to local products being displaced by foreign products that are imported. So we see for you to remember, Dutch disease is the reduction of non-rent related economic activities, both in industry and agriculture. And particularly agriculture it's that we see the nefarious effects of the displacement of agriculture is something very, very dominant in the Muslim countries that we look at. And it's something that, for example, in the book I just mentioned, Homar Khatouzian explains quite well for the Iranian economy. One possible response to the problems of Dutch disease is the creation of sovereign wealth funds. It's the idea that you somehow sterilize the foreign currency inflows by actually not allowing them into the local economy, but keeping them outside and investing them outside in other economies, and therefore avoiding these displacement effects in the local economy and also the inflation effects it might have. And the added advantage of wealth funds is that they help to stabilize otherwise highly fluctuating resource inflows that stem from the fluctuating nature of commodity prices. So that would allow the state to plan more stably in the medium and long term. And this is what we see many countries actually adopting. They have now created these wealth funds. And perhaps the best example and one of the best functioning of these examples is the Norwegian state pension fund that takes almost all of the receipts from the Norwegian oil and places it into a wealth fund. Now, we don't have the time to go into the nature of these wealth funds, but just for you, one of the things to remember is, again, that in order to manage a wealth fund successfully and avoid the social and political pressure to consume these receipts immediately, you need a fairly developed political and institutional system. And that allows us to understand why, for example, the Norwegian wealth fund functions relatively well and functions in a high tax, high production, efficient economy type environment, whereas in the Gulf countries, they do not function as well as this. There we have much, much greater proportions of the oil that's being used simply for consumption. And the reason for this, again, it's not in culture or in religion. It's in the lack of the institutional capacities of the, let's say, the Qatari state versus the Norwegian state. Just try to keep it in mind. So one of the problems of resource plenty is, as we just discussed, in combination with the weak institutional bureaucratic capacity, that it leads to misallocation of funds. Because funds are overabundant, they get allocated inefficiently. So we see common problems that the investments get concentrated into a few localities. There's little industrial exchange within the country. There is a weakening of traditional industries that exist through displacement effects. So overall, we see suboptimal growth in these economies. And that's one of the general problems we observe in countries that are resource abundant. Now, there's an additional problem is that the states, therefore, because they have access to this free and easy income, they have no economic interest to diversify their economies. And that leads to the problem that job opportunities for local citizens are not sufficiently created. And so they are only artificially created in a bloated state administration, but the economies are unable to actually provide the type of jobs that would allow citizens to have a meaningful economic life. And if you look here, for example, this is just one example. It shows the composition of the exports made by Saudi Arabia, and that is very representative of some of the other Gulf economies, but also Iran. Is you see that overwhelmingly is the export of crude oil, and then you see some parts of oil-related products, so refined oil, and then the pink areas are again stuff that is made from oil. So there's an attempt to go downstream in the value chain of oil, and only at the bottom are very, very marginal are other non-oil products that the country produces and that it can export. And that picture we see throughout the region here. All of the oil-endowed countries have an overwhelmingly loop-sided economy that is dependent on oil. And that is, the problem for this is not only that it makes the state dependent on only one source of income, but also that job opportunities in the economy are not created for its citizens. Now, I said one of the responses these patrimonial regimes have taken is to create jobs in the state bureaucracy for its citizens. Another approach is through a peculiar form of protectionism that exists, is that they do not allow foreign companies to operate freely in their economies. So you have the system of kafala in the Gulf region, which requires every foreign company to have a majority owner who is a local citizen. And the fact that then it actually plays out is that a Saudi or Qatari or Bahraini citizen is taken who nominally holds 51% of the economic activity, and he's then paid a portion of the profits simply for lending his name to the enterprise. And you can see that, first of all, this is just another form of rent. So citizenship itself becomes a direct source of rent for the individuals, but it also creates tremendous inefficiencies. It limits the numbers of companies who want to operate, and it also limits the way they can operate. And it creates managerial problems between that nominally in charge Saudi or Kuwaiti citizen and the people who are actually in charge and who actually take the economic risk in that activity. So this is a peculiar form of protectionism that dramatically distorts the local economies and carries a relatively heavy economic price. As you will see later towards the end of this video, it carries also a very heavy social price. Now, the second problems of rents are the institutional problems. We already mentioned that it isolates the state from the necessity to extract resources. So it does not build the tax collecting bureaucratic capacities it needs. And therefore its extractive but also regulatory capacity of the state remains underdeveloped. And particularly in times of plenty, when oil receipts are very high, the structural shortcomings in the regulatory and capacity of the state become masked. And then when oil receipts fall, as they did, for example, in the 90s, dramatic shortcomings are exposed. And it's particularly in these types of crises when these capacities are most needed, and that's when they're not there. So you see oil wealth or the rents shielding existing shortcomings in the capacity of the state. With the failure to develop extractive capacities of the state, other capacities remain also underdeveloped, in particular the coercive ability and bureaucratic organization of state institutions. So that's another insidious problem. The partial answer to this is that the state administrations are created not to actually carry out functional mandates, but to create jobs for local citizens. So they are bloated and inefficient, and they're bloated and inefficient by design. And that is a problem in the institutional characteristics. So try to remember that this evolutionary process of state formation is now stalled due to the existence of rents. The third problem we have with the existence of rents are political. Now try to imagine what it means for a state which does not have to collect taxes. Try to think of your own systems in which you live. If you live in countries where competitive elections are held, one of the things that is always on the agenda that is very actively discussed is a question of taxes and how to spend it. And here, this whole problem does not exist. Taxes are not collected, and how it's spent is the absolute decision of the local ruler. So the rents have a profound impact on political life, and it basically leads to the absence of organized political activity. And it's no coincidence that the only forms of active opposition we see, for example, in Saudi Arabia and in some of the others, are in the 1960s before oil wells really started to set in. So we see the nucleus of political activity existing before oil set in, but once the rents and the transfer payments and the buying off of opposition that it permitted the state, political activity basically withered away. But as we will shortly see, that problem continues to exist because it creates a very sterile political environment, and some of the problems that do persist then find violent outlets. And here it's perhaps important to remember that patronage in the Saudi and also in the other Khaliji systems had always existed, but we now see a new quality of patronage. It now reaches virtually all citizens. So the reach of the state and its ability to dispense patronage is now dramatically increased. And it comes to define national politics. And it's a very artificial way of conducting politics. And because the state has a stable and essentially free income, there's no incentive to open up the political system and increase participation. And this dead end of political activity ultimately leads to violent outbreaks, to which we will come in a minute. The fourth implications of rents are the social implications of the existence of essentially free income. As I said, it does not necessarily allow the state to permanently buy immunity for civil pressure, but it's allowed them to buy temporary complacency. So organized politics remains largely absent, and we're dealing with societies where there's no working class and where the middle class is essentially dependent on state patronage. And these are states that rely on a very heavy religious legitimization, and it creates for an uneasy cohabitation with the religious authorities and the authorities of the state. We see, for example, in the Saudi case, which is the clearest iteration of this, is, as you know, they had entered this formal alliance with the Wahhabi family and the puritanical creed of Islam in 1744. And so it's an integral part of how they define themselves and on which they base their claim to rulership. So the official ulema, the official clergy, or the religious authorities, they become involved in sanctioning government action. So there's an uneasy cohabitation between the government and the local, the official religious authorities. The government has to ask them to sanction important decisions. For example, in the Saudi case, you have when the deposition of King Saud had to happen due to old age, or more importantly, when local terrorists took over the Grand Mosque in 1979, to which we come in a minute, or the presence of foreign troops in 1990, then the local ulema is involved in sanctioning these decisions. But that alliance between official religious authorities and the state creates a problem for legitimacy now also for the ulema, because they get compromised by the lifestyle that is so conspicuous with the government. And you see now within these societies develop popular notions of Islam that is much more radical than the officially sanctioned notion of Islam. And we saw here in 79 is probably the most dramatic instance of this, where a Saudi citizen, Juhayman al-Uthaybi, and a group of his followers, they took over the Grand Mosque and presented a challenge to the government, saying basically this government, and by implication the religious authorities that are with them, are illegitimate. They do not live up to the standards which they had been proclaiming. And this incident is important also for other aspects, because the Saudi security apparatus was unable to subdue them. They had to call in foreign help. I believe from Pakistan. Pakistani commanders were then called in, and there was a very active, very violent confrontation that took several weeks. And these are his co-conspirators, all of whom were then executed in a very public show of reassertion by the government. But the damage was done, and the damage is ultimately in terms of the religious legitimacy claimed by the government. And we see this aspect of religious opposition, and that, remember, against the backdrop of no other political opposition or actually any political activity existing. So religious opposition again becomes more or less the only form in which opposition can be expressed. Here we see a gathering of Shiites who are protesting the Sunni government in Bahrain, and you have this inner religious tension in quite a few of these societies, and it's unresolved by the official notion of religion that is used by the state to buttress its authority. And it's the very co-optation of the religious authorities by the state that leads to a weakening of their claim to authority. And that we will come back to in further lectures. But you see here an inherent, almost structural tendency towards polarization and radicalization of the religious discourse due to the absence of any other form of legitimate political discourse. And that's a very important problem we see throughout the region, and we will come back to this. But to try to keep it in mind now, that the use of religion by the state ultimately leads to a delegitimization of official religion, and therefore has an inbuilt tendency towards radicalization of religious discourse. Try to keep this in mind. And this is against the background of, and this is why it's so insidious, particularly in the Gulf, is because we're dealing here with states whose almost exclusive claim to legitimacy and rulership is simply the mere fact that they've been there for a long time, the ability that they can spend lots of oil wealth, but that has now penetrated the population, that the oil wealth is not coming from the king, but it's already there, and any other ruler would dispose of it as well. And then, so their main claim to legitimacy is that they uphold the Islamic law, that they uphold religion. And therefore, charges of deviation from religious dogma, from the Sharia, are very, very damaging to the stability of these regimes. And that, again, explains why the discourse, the political discourse that now starts to develop in opposition is so heavily religiously based and so radicalized, because it's the most effective attack on the stability and legitimacy of these governments. And it's a self-imposed vulnerability, because it goes back to the explicit alliance with puritanical Islam that particularly Saudi Arabia, but also some of the other Gulf states have entered into in the past. So the deliberate absence of a political space and the fostering of religious legitimation creates now problems that are self-chosen. We see that in pursuit of their religious legitimacy, we see all of these governments, particularly the Saudi government, investing very heavily in religious education. So by the early 90s, you have 1/4, and this is a dramatic number if you think about it, 1/4 of all university students are engaged in religious education. And even during the 90s, when the government resources fell, funding to religious institutions and the religious universities did not stop and was not reduced, where funding for everything else was reduced. So you see, the government sees this as a very important part of its legitimacy. But it's now in these very institutions where, almost by default, because there's no other avenues for the expression of grievances, you see now in one place you have the physical locations, you have the intellectuals, you have the ideas, you have the the libraries, the means of communication, in which opposition and opposing ideas are formulated, and they are formulated in religious terms. And the way they are now formulated is obviously in opposition to the official doctrine, which is already fairly puritanical, if you remember. And so we see a dramatic radicalization of religious thinking. And it is by no means coincidental if you look, for example, just to take one little data fact. If you look at the 19 hijackers who were involved in the 9/11 attacks, 15 of them were Saudi and 2 of them were Emiratis. And this is not a coincidence. We see here a population of particularly young men being raised in these institutions who are very, very extreme in their way of what constitutes proper Islam. And that is a direct outcome of deliberate choices by the government, and to which we will come back to again. But at this point, I'd like you to remember that the use of religion for political purposes and for the purpose of stabilization now has the unintended effect of destabilizing these social arrangements and radicalizing a whole generation. And it's, again, no coincidence that private Saudi and Emirate Gulf funding for Sunni terrorist groups is by far the largest source of income that these groups have. And we saw in the attempts by the United Nations Sanctions Committee, for example, it's a very prominent list of charities from these areas that are fronts for financing of these very radical, very aggressive ideas abroad. So you see that, in a sense, it's coming back to haunt the stability of these governments. Now, another unrelated problem for the social implications of the rent is the paradoxical persistence of poverty in these societies. It's paradoxical because you have societies that have enormous amounts of wealth at their disposal, yet partially due to deliberate decisions, but primarily because simply the state administrative capacities are not efficient enough to ensure an equal distribution. You see, in all, not in all, but particularly in the larger populations, states, you have persistent poverty. In Saudi Arabia, for example, of parts of the population that are excluded from the wealth. In Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, particularly the Shiites, but it's something that you need to be aware of, that the poverty that exists internally is surprising, and it's a source of instability. But the other more important source of potential instability is and it's a direct outcome from the availability of rental income, is the extremely high presence of foreign workers. So in Saudi Arabia, which is a relatively large society, you have fully 30% of the population, corresponding to 70% of the labor force, are foreign workers. And in the smaller societies like Qatar or Dubai, the presence of foreigners is well in excess of 90%. And this the state bureaucracies are unable to deal and control with these numbers effectively. So they essentially outsource the control of foreigners in their societies to private individuals through the legal instruments of kafala, to which we come in a minute. So, as in any society that is small and surrounded now by very, very large numbers of foreigners, you have a siege mentality developing. There are fears of cultural alienation, of loss of tradition, of identity, and ultimately of political unrest stemming from these disenfranchised migrant workers. So the way the government and these societies have tried to respond to them is through controlling the legal status of these people, of the migrant workers who are now there, through a control of their their residency status. And the way it is done is not done through the state, but it's done through private individuals. And it uses a perhaps customary Bedouin practice, the legal instrument of a kafala, of a guardianship, of a guarantor, that the foreign worker now needs a local citizen who guarantees his application for a visa to come and work. And in combination with an exit visa system, so the foreign workers also need an exit visa, a special permit to leave the country again. And his local sponsor, he needs the permission of the local sponsor to change jobs, to leave the country, to open a bank account, to take a driver's license, to do any administrative act at all. He needs the permission of the local sponsor. And it's not hard now for you to imagine that this leads to an extremely exposed, weak legal and social position of the migrant worker in these societies. And it essentially leads to slave-like conditions where people are fully disenfranchised. They're essentially outlaws. They're completely at the mercy of their local sponsor. And this is already quite dramatic for people particularly from the Indian subcontinent and the Philippines who work in construction and in other clerical jobs. But it's dramatic for household labor, people who come to work in their homes of Saudi or Khaliji families. And it's here where we see the most appalling abuses. And these are not isolated instances. If you, in a recent report by Human Rights Watch, and I could read similar reports from anybody else, they compare this to, and they describe the situation as, I'm quoting, the combination of the high recruitment fees paid by Saudi employers and the power granted them by the kafala system to control whether a worker can change employers or exit the country made some employers feel entitled to exert ownership over a domestic worker, and that the sense of ownership creates slavery-like conditions. And I leave the implications of this to your imagination, but just one thing which goes back to the religious legitimization of these states and societies. Many of these people are from other Muslim societies. Now, the domestic workers mostly come from the Philippines and they're not Muslims. But the societies have to question themselves whether this claim to piousness, to religiously founded justice, is compatible with the way they treat fellow human beings, but perhaps more importantly in their own normative system, fellow Muslims. I've mentioned at various points that the stability of these regimes is based on the external protection by other outside forces. And that's something we will look at in the next video when we look at the seemingly paradoxical alliances that buttress the stability of the principalities in the Gulf region.